So I thought I'd describe the process that's now going to go on around trans activists. So what's happened is, for a considerable period of time, dissonance has been created by a combination of things. So the first thing is that we all wanted to be inclusive, and we didn't want to see what was in front of us with trans activism. And we all know transsexuals were, they are dealing with inequality, so we assumed it was that. So you've got the desire to be good, but we also had way of media, politics and academia. And we had a demonstration of how this nexus came behind this group, so that not only could they create dissonance with their words, but they had power so that people would not say or see what was in front of them. And this is what the likes of John Ozimek and Ros Kavini. Now, one of the things that trans activists have done is they've targeted incredibly young and vulnerable people in the first years of higher education, and so they have created an inroad in student politics and followed very much left-wing entryism techniques to do this. And this was actually fairly successful. I mean, it's all very well that we've crashed the Fair Play server today, the Gender Recognition Act server today, but 2 years ago you couldn't even say a lesbian doesn't do dick without being abused for it. We've seen rape victims abused, we've seen domestic abuse victims abused, Lib Dem trans activists hounding domestic abuse survivors with this narcissistic abuse. And now we've reached a point where women have said no, and then we've let the rage demonstrate why the no was necessary. And the next stage of this is that this is now attached to scalps across politics. So what will happen now is the very senior figures in elite institutions who just went brave and stunning and couldn't hear what the trans activists had said because they had reduced trans activists to objects in their own identity and just wanted to jump on this bandwagon, they're now going to start listening. Now, this has been happening slightly. It's been happening a bit. I think Amy Challoner and David Challoner woke people up a little bit. Some of the behaviours, some of the interviews have made people go, But what our biggest strength now is, because we're not arguing with reality, we're just having the conversation that we're having. While we're having that conversation about these systems, and I'm going to do that playlist about the other rule of law that's going to become apparent in the next couple of years, all those people are going to be going back and listening and actually looking, and the dissonance is going to fall. So you've got like Sarah, what's-her-face, Public Goat, with the Lib Dems, whose entire role as pretending to be a woman has been about attacking sex-based protections and women's rights and safeguarding. People are going to start listening to what John Ozimek was actually saying. People are going to actually start looking at what Ros Kavini was saying, India Willoughby, and actually realising they're going to start looking at what they're saying, but in the context of reality. And when they were trying to keep us all off Twitter, they were trying to create an environment where reality didn't provide that context. And that's all we ever had to do, was provide that context. And it would break, which is happening. So what's going to happen now is they're going to be kind of screaming the things that they have always screamed and wondering why they're not getting the same response and getting confused. So when they say that it's feminism to abuse women and to assault women and to prevent women meeting, and when they say that safeguarding is apartheid, they're going to be starting to wonder why it is that when they're saying this, people are kind of looking at them and going, instead of going brave and stunning. And what happens now is, the problem is that when you reduce people to objects, which is what elite cultures did with trans activists, you can't hear them and you idealise them. Well, the next stage of that is a devaluation. And so while we have to really, really use what they've done, they've demanded recognition of these systems, and we have to make sure that that happens, and we have to discuss the rule of law and the wider context. We don't have to discuss them anymore. What should happen is they should start being listened to. And they should do the work for us. I think India Willoughby and John Ozimek were on Derbyshire Live going, it's a conspiracy. Karen White was put in there to make us look bad. No, this would always have happened. And what's becoming apparent is that they were not aware of this context because they couldn't see past their own identity. And people are going to start noticing that. And you'll see, I'm sure that a few of them will continue to get elevation for a while yet, but what you'll find is that the response they get is much, much, much different. And people start to back away. Now, most people won't say that they were screaming tough. They'll pretend that they were a tough. Do you know what I mean? It's pathetic. People do that, and people will pretend that they believe stuff all along, and they will backtrack quietly, and you'll wonder why. And the landscape changes that way. But largely this is what happens with narcissistic bubbles. Once they're popped, they're popped. Now, as the layer upon layer of consequences of this, particularly the consequences on children and the long-term consequences of the young people who have been groomed by those charities at the core of this, that becomes apparent. That's going to create more and more waves of backlash and cement this process. And then within that, you have the other question of what do you do about the fact that gender dysphoria is still a thing. There are still people suffering gender dysphoria. There are many transsexuals who, you know, they were not interested in abusing women. They did not see it that way. And so, for those of us stood with those people, I think we're probably in for a bit of a lonely road. And I think when I wrote Recipe for a Backlash, I don't think I'd really envisaged it getting this big. But largely the outcome of this is useful. They will now be listened to. We have exposed the fundamental weaknesses in elite institutions and where they're not aware of these systems. We have a full picture of that now. We have academics like Kathleen Stock. We have, you know, the House of Lords Women's Place UK meeting was almost entirely about the fact that we haven't done that alignment of legal frameworks. The blind spot is in academia, it is in politics, and we're in the process of rectifying that. And this episode is done, really. It's really done. Their accusations will get madder and madder and madder, but people will start listening to them now, and people will just be looking at them going, what the fucking fuck, and pretending that they never listened in the first place. And by the way, lesbians can be kicked out of feminism for not doing dick. When did you know they were men? Well, Your Honour, when they started trying to kick the lesbians out of feminism for not doing dick. That's kind of at the extreme end of rapey fucker, really, I've got to be honest.